Martha Brennan stood in the gravel parking lot of the Prairie Valley Cooperative grain elevator on a Tuesday morning in late October. The sky, the color of old pewter, and the wind carrying the smell of harvested fields and diesel exhaust. She was 47 years old, widowed 3 years, and she had just spent 6 months and every dollar she had left in the world growing 80 acres of corn on the farm her husband Patrick had left her. The farm that had been in his family since 1892, the farm that had survived the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression and the farm crisis of the 1980s, the farm that was now, according to the man in the blue jacket with the co-op logo on his chest, worth less than the cost of harvesting it. "Market price is $3.20 a bushel, Martha," Dale Henderson said, not unkindly. Because Dale had known Patrick since kindergarten and had sat in the pew behind her at the funeral, and had genuinely believed once upon a time that farming was a noble profession. "Your yield's running about 140 bushels to the acre. That's maybe $35,000, $36,000 gross. Your harvest costs alone are gonna run you $18,000. Then you've got seed, fertilizer, diesel, equipment maintenance, land payment, insurance. You're underwater, Martha, way underwater. The board met last night. We can't extend you any more credit. I'm sorry, I really am." He handed her a piece of paper. She didn't take it at first. She just stood there, her work boots planted in the gravel, her hands in the pockets of her canvas jacket, looking past Dale at the grain elevator that towered over the town like a concrete cathedral. The conveyor belt silent now, the season almost done, the trucks that had rumbled through all summer parked in rows along the fence. "You're saying I should leave it in the field," she said. Not a question. A statement of fact that she was still trying to understand. "I'm saying the co-op can't buy it. Not at a price that makes sense for you or for us. The ethanol plants are backed up. The export market's dead because of the trade war. The livestock guys are buying cheap from Argentina. There's no market, Martha. None. You'd spend $18,000 to harvest $35,000 worth of corn that nobody wants to buy. That's not farming. That's arithmetic. And the math doesn't work." She took the paper then. It was a letter, official, with the co-op letterhead and the signatures of 3 board members she had known her entire life. Men who had eaten at her table, who had danced at her wedding, who had stood beside Patrick's casket and promised her they would look out for her. The letter said what Dale had said, but in language that made it real. Default notice, credit termination, recommendation that she consider alternative uses for the land or pursue Chapter 12 bankruptcy. She folded it carefully, put it in her jacket pocket, and walked to her truck. She didn't cry. Not then. She had learned not to cry in public, not after Patrick died, not after the first year of trying to run the farm alone, not after the nights when she sat at the kitchen table with the bills spread out like a losing hand of cards, and realized that every decision she made was wrong, and every path she took led deeper into debt. She drove home, 80 acres of standing corn on either side of the gravel road, the stalks brown and dry, the ears hanging heavy, waiting for a combine that might never come. The farm was 15 miles from town, down a county road that turned to dirt after the creek crossing, past the Henderson place and the old Miller Ranch and the fields that had been farmed by the same families for 5 generations. She passed the cemetery where Patrick was buried, the white headstone visible from the road, and she didn't look. She couldn't look. Not today. The house was a 2-story farmhouse built in 1910, white clapboard with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, a roof that needed replacing, a furnace that worked only when it felt like it. She parked in the driveway and sat in the truck for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled, the radio playing something country and sad that she didn't really hear. She thought about the corn, 80 acres, 6 months of work. Up at 5 every morning, checking the fields, watching the weather, praying for rain, and then praying for it to stop, fighting the weeds and the insects and the deer that came out of the timber at night to strip the ears. She had done everything right, everything Patrick would have done. And it wasn't enough. She got out of the truck and walked to the barn. It was a big barn, red with white trim, built in the 1930s by Patrick's grandfather with timber from the property and labor from neighbors who understood that a barn raising was an investment in the community's future. Inside, it smelled of hay and motor oil and the particular mustiness of old wood. The combine sat in the center bay, a John Deere 9X600 that Patrick had bought used in 2008 and rebuilt with his own hands, maintained with a devotion that bordered on religious. It was worth more than the house. It was worth more than everything else she owned combined. And it was useless without a market for the corn it harvested. She climbed into the cab and sat in the driver's seat, her hands on the wheel, her eyes on the dusty windshield. Patrick had taught her to run this machine. He had sat in the passenger seat for her first harvest, patient and quiet, letting her make mistakes, letting her learn, trusting that she would figure it out the way he had figured it out, the way his father had figured it out, the way generations of Brennans had figured out how to coax a living from the stubborn soil of central Iowa. "You're a farmer, Marty," he had said the last time they had ridden together, 3 weeks before the heart attack that took him in the field, in the cab of this very combine, his hand still on the throttle when she found him. Not because of the land, not because of the equipment, because of the stubbornness, because of the refusal to quit. That's what farming is. That's what makes you one of us. She had believed him. She had held on to that belief through the first year alone, through the second, through the creditors, and the late payments and the phone calls from the bank that she stopped answering because she didn't have anything to tell them. She had believed that if she just worked hard enough, if she just farmed well enough, if she just held on long enough, the market would turn, the prices would rise. The world would remember that farmers mattered and farming was worth doing. But the co-op letter in her pocket said otherwise. The co-op letter said that 80 acres of good corn, well tended, properly grown, harvested at the right moisture content with the right protein levels and the right test weight, was worth less than the cost of putting it in a truck. The co-op letter said that the world didn't care about her work or her husband's memory or the 120 years of Brennan family farming. The co-op letter said that she was done. She sat in the combine until dark. She didn't move. She didn't think. Exactly. She just existed, suspended between the person she had been that morning, a farmer with a crop to sell, and the person she was now, whatever that was. When she finally climbed down, her legs stiff and her hands numb from gripping the wheel, she walked to the house and made herself a sandwich she didn't eat and sat at the kitchen table with the bills and the letter and the silence that had become her only companion. And then she did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She opened Patrick's laptop. He had been the one who understood technology, who had subscribed to farming magazines and market newsletters and online forums where farmers from across the country shared ideas and commiserated about prices and weather and the endless struggle to stay afloat. She had never been interested. She had farmed the way her mother-in-law had farmed, the way her grandmother had farmed, with intuition and experience and a deep trust in the cycles of the earth. But Patrick had been different. Patrick had believed that the future of farming was not in growing more, but in growing smarter, in finding markets that others missed, in adding value instead of adding volume. The laptop was old, a Dell from 2014 that took 10 minutes to boot up. She didn't know his password, but she tried their anniversary, then his birthday, then hers. And then she remembered the combination he used for everything. The date they had bought the farm, the day they had become not just husband and wife, but partners in something larger than themselves. It worked. The desktop was a mess of icons, folders, documents, spreadsheets. She clicked through them randomly at first, not sure what she was looking for, just needing to feel close to him, to hear his voice in the words he had written, to remember what it felt like to have someone who believed in her. She found the farm records, the tax documents, the insurance policies, the will. She found photos of their wedding, of their first harvest together, of the time they had won the blue ribbon at the county fair for the biggest pumpkin in the state. She found a folder labeled Ideas and opened it. Inside were dozens of documents, business plans, market analyses, notes from conferences he had attended in Des Moines and Omaha and Chicago, articles he had saved about niche crops and value-added products and direct-to-consumer marketing. One document caught her eye: corn oil processing, feasibility study. She opened it. It was dated March 2015, 8 months before he died. He had been researching cold-pressed corn oil, a product she had never heard of. The document was 20 pages long, filled with charts and graphs and links to websites she didn't recognize. He had calculated the yield of oil per bushel of corn, the equipment costs, the market prices for cold-pressed oils, the potential profit margins. He had identified a gap in the market: high quality, locally produced corn oil for restaurants and health food stores and home cooks who cared about where their food came from. He had even found a supplier of small-scale oil press machines, a company in Nebraska that sold equipment designed for farms exactly like hers. At the bottom of the document, in the notes section, he had written, "Marty would hate this. Too complicated, too risky, but the numbers work. If corn stays under $4, this is our exit strategy, our way forward, our way to keep the farm." She read it 3 times. Then she closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, the only light coming from the refrigerator door she had left open. The hum of the motor, the only sound in the house. She thought about the corn in the field. 80 acres, maybe 11,000 bushels. At $3.20 a bushel, worthless. But for oil? The document said a bushel of corn yielded about 2.5 gallons of cold-pressed oil. At $15 a gallon wholesale, that was $37 a bushel. $37, not $3.20. 37 for the same corn. The same corn that Dale Henderson had told her to leave in the field. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with Patrick's feasibility study and a calculator and a notepad, working the numbers over and over, checking his math, finding errors, correcting them, finding that even with conservative estimates, even with higher equipment costs than he had projected, even with the learning curve and the mistakes and the inevitable setbacks, the numbers still worked. They didn't just work, they sang. At dawn, she made coffee and walked to the field. The corn stood in rows that stretched to the horizon, the ears heavy with grain, the stalks rustling in the morning breeze. She walked between the rows, touching the ears, feeling the weight of them, calculating in her head how many gallons of oil each acre would produce, how many bottles she could fill, how many restaurants she could supply, how many farmers' markets she could attend. She walked the entire 80 acres, her boots getting wet with dew, her coffee growing cold in the cup she carried, and by the time she reached the end of the last row, she knew what she was going to do. She was going to press the corn into oil. The first problem was equipment. Patrick's feasibility study had identified a company in Nebraska that sold small-scale oil presses. But the machine he had researched cost $12,000, and she had less than $2,000 in her checking account, and a credit card that was already maxed out. She called the company anyway, a small operation run by a man named Carl who had started pressing sunflower oil on his own farm and had built a business selling equipment to other farmers who wanted to do the same. 12,000's the base model, Carl said, his voice crackling over the phone line. Hydraulic press, electric motor, capacity about 50 gallons a day. But I got a used one in the shop. Customer upgraded to a bigger unit last year. It's a 2018 model, been refurbished, works like new. I can let it go for 6,000. That's the best I can do, ma'am. I know it's still a lot of money. It was. It was more money than she had. But she had the combine, she had the tractor. She had the farm equipment that Patrick had maintained with such care, equipment that was worth something, even if the corn wasn't. She called the bank. Not the bank that held her mortgage. She owed them too much already and they had stopped returning her calls. She called the credit union in town. The one run by people she had known since childhood. The one that had financed her first car and her wedding, and the addition to the house where Patrick had died. She told them the truth, all of it. The co-op letter, the market prices, the 80 acres of corn that was worth more as oil than as grain, the equipment she needed, the risk she was taking, the fact that she had no collateral left except the farm itself and the equipment that sat in the barn. She told them about Patrick's feasibility study, about the numbers he had run, about the market gap he had identified. She told them she had never done anything like this before, that she didn't know if it would work, that she was asking them to bet on a widow with a failing farm and a crazy idea. The loan officer was a woman named Janet who had gone to high school with Martha's older sister. She listened without interrupting. She asked questions about the oil press, the market, the competition, the logistics. She asked about Martha's experience with food processing, with business management, with sales and marketing. Martha answered honestly, she had none. She was a farmer. She grew corn. That was all she had ever done. But she was willing to learn. She was willing to work. She was willing to do whatever it took to save the farm that had been in her husband's family for 5 generations. Janet was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Give me 24 hours." Martha spent those 24 hours in the barn, cleaning the combine, organizing the tools, trying to keep her hands busy so her mind wouldn't spin into the darkness that waited at the edges of her thoughts. She called the co-op back and told Dale she wasn't going to leave the corn in the field. She was going to harvest it herself. She didn't tell him why. She didn't owe him an explanation. She just told him she would need the grain bin for storage until she figured out her next move, and he agreed, reluctantly. Because the co-op still had a contract with her for storage, and because Dale Henderson was not a cruel man, just a practical one. The next morning, Janet called. The credit union had approved a loan. Not 6,000, they couldn't justify that on her financials. But 4,000, enough for the used oil press with some left over for bottles, labels, a website, and the miscellaneous expenses that always appeared when you started something new. The interest rate was high, the terms were strict, and the collateral was everything she owned. But she had the money. She drove to Nebraska that weekend, 16 hours each way in Patrick's old pickup, the one with the cracked windshield and the radio that only picked up AM stations. She met Carl at his farm, a tidy operation with a red barn and a white house, and the smell of sunflower oil in the air that reminded her of something she couldn't name. He showed her the press, a stainless steel machine the size of a large refrigerator, with a hopper on top and a spigot on the side, and a complexity of gears and motors that made her stomach clench with doubt. "It's simpler than it looks," Carl said, reading her face. "I spent 2 days with the first one I bought, taking it apart, putting it back together, figuring out how it worked. Once you understand the basics, heat, pressure, filtration, it's just a machine. It does what you tell it to do. The hard part's not the pressing. The hard part's everything else. He showed her how to operate it, how to adjust the temperature, how to control the pressure, how to filter the oil, how to test for quality, how to bottle it, label it, store it. He gave her a manual, a video tutorial, and his phone number, which he said she could call anytime, day or night, and he would answer. He helped her load the press into the truck, secured it with ratchet straps, shook her hand, and told her something she would remember for the rest of her life. My wife thought I was crazy when I bought my first press, he said. We were broke. The bank was calling. The co-op had written us off. She said I was throwing good money after bad, that I should sell the farm and get a job in town like a normal person. I didn't listen. Not because I'm stubborn, though I am. Because I could see something she couldn't. I could see that the old way was dead. That growing commodities for a market that didn't care about us was a trap. That the only way forward was to stop being a grower and start being a maker. To take what we grew and turn it into something nobody else could make. Something that had our name on it. Our story. Our sweat. He looked at her with eyes that had seen the same desperation she was feeling, the same doubt, the same terror of failure. You can do this, Martha. I don't know you. I don't know your farm. I don't know if the numbers will work out the way you hope. But I know that the people who make it through aren't the smartest or the luckiest or the ones with the most money. They're the ones who can't quit. The ones who have something they can't walk away from. Do you have that? She thought of Patrick in the combine, of the barn his grandfather had built, of the cemetery where 5 generations of Brennans were buried, of the corn in the field that she had tended with her own hands, that she had watched grow from seed to stalk to ear, that she had prayed over and worried over and loved in a way that made no sense to anyone who hadn't done it. Yes, she said, I have that. She drove home through the night, the press rattling in the truck bed behind her, the AM radio playing static, and the occasional country song that she didn't listen to. She thought about what Carl had said, about being a maker instead of a grower, about putting her name on something, about telling her story. She had never thought of herself as a storyteller. She was a farmer. Farmers didn't tell stories. They worked, they produced. They fed the world and went to bed tired and got up and did it again. That was the deal. That was the contract. But the contract was broken. The world had changed. The co-op had written her off. The market had abandoned her. The system that was supposed to reward hard work and good farming had instead made her labor worthless. She could accept that and walk away, sell the farm, move to town, get a job at the Walmart or the nursing home or the school cafeteria. She could become one of the statistics that economists cited when they talked about the death of the family farm. She could let the Brennan name disappear from the land, let the barn fall down, let the fields go to weeds and then to developers who would build houses where corn had grown, or she could fight. She got home at dawn on Monday morning, exhausted and sore, and more afraid than she had been since Patrick died. But she had the press, she had the loan, she had the corn in the field and the numbers in her head, and the memory of her husband's voice telling her she was a farmer because of her stubbornness, her refusal to quit. She spent the next week preparing. She cleaned out a corner of the barn, swept the concrete floor, hung lights, ran an electrical line from the house. She ordered bottles from a supplier in Missouri, clear glass with cork stoppers, the kind that looked like something you would find in a specialty store rather than a supermarket. She designed a label on Patrick's laptop, simple and elegant, with a drawing of an ear of corn and the words, Brennan Farm Cold-Pressed Corn Oil, in a font that reminded her of the sign over her grandmother's general store. She researched food safety regulations, state licensing requirements, cottage food laws, the labyrinth of rules that governed what you could sell and how you could sell it And who could stop you if you did it wrong? She called the state extension office and spoke to a food safety specialist who walked her through the process of getting her kitchen certified for commercial use, which involved more paperwork and more inspections and more money she didn't have. She called the county health department and scheduled an inspection. She called a lawyer in Des Moines and paid him $200 to review her label and make sure she wasn't violating any truth in advertising laws. She called restaurants in Iowa City and Cedar Rapids and Des Moines, introducing herself, explaining what she was doing, asking if they would be interested in sampling her oil when it was ready. Most of them said no. Some of them hung up on her. A few said maybe, send a sample, we'll see. One chef, a woman named Rosa, who ran a farm-to-table restaurant in Iowa City, said something different. I've been looking for a local corn oil for 2 years, Rosa said. Everything on the market is commodity stuff, mass-produced, no flavor, no character. If you can make something that tastes like corn actually tastes, sweet, nutty, complex, I'll buy everything you can produce. But it has to be good. It has to be special. It has to be worth putting on my menu. I don't know if it's good yet, Martha admitted. I've never done this before. Then figure it out, Rosa said. That's what farmers do, they figure it out. The harvest came in early November. She did it herself, running the combine through the fields in long straight rows, the corn flowing into the grain tank, the dust rising behind her like a ghost of all the harvests that had come before. It took 3 days, working from dawn to dusk, stopping only to eat sandwiches and drink coffee and stretch her back. The yield was good, 145 bushels to the acre, better than she had expected, the best crop she had grown since Patrick died. She stored it in the co-op bin, paying the storage fee with the last of her credit, and she started pressing. The first batch was a disaster. She didn't understand the temperature settings. The oil came out dark and bitter, smelling more like burnt popcorn than food. She threw it away, all 5 gallons, and sat in the barn and cried for the first time since Dale Henderson had handed her the letter. She cried for Patrick, for the farm, for the corn that she had grown so carefully and ruined so quickly, for the stupidity of thinking she could do something she had never done before and succeed at it. Then she called Carl. Burnt oil means too hot, he said. Patient, not surprised. Corn's a delicate grain. You need to keep the press temperature under 120. Slower is better. Think of it like cooking. Low and slow. You can't rush it. She tried again, adjusted the temperature, reduced the pressure, fed the corn into the hopper a handful at a time, watching the oil trickle out, golden and clear, smelling of something she had never smelled before. The essence of corn, concentrated and pure, sweet and nutty and alive. She bottled it carefully, labeled it by hand, held it up to the light, and she understood for the first time what Carl had meant about being a maker. This was hers, not the corn. The corn had always been hers, but it had also been the co-ops, the markets, the commodity systems. She had grown it and sold it and lost money on it and never seen it again. But this oil, this golden liquid in this clear bottle with this label she had designed herself, this was hers in a way that nothing had been since Patrick died. She had made it. She had transformed the corn from a commodity into something unique, something that carried her name, her story, her place. She took a sample to Rosa in Iowa City, drove 2 hours with 6 bottles in a cooler in the back of the truck, nervous, sweating, rehearsing what she would say. Rosa met her at the restaurant door, a small woman with tattoos on her arms and a chef's coat that had seen better days. She took the bottle, opened it, smelled it, poured a drop into a spoon, tasted it. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she looked at Martha with eyes that were serious and kind and something else. Hope, maybe, or recognition. "This is good," she said. "This is really good. Better than the imported stuff I pay $20 a bottle for. How much can you make? Martha had done the math. The press could process about 50 gallons of oil a day, working 10 hours. She had 11,000 bushels of corn, at 2.5 gallons per bushel. That was 27,000 gallons of oil. At $15 a gallon wholesale, that was $400,000. $400,000. For corn that the co-op had valued at $35,000. I can make as much as you need, she said. Rosa ordered 200 gallons to start, paid a deposit, gave Martha a purchase order on the spot. And then she did something that Martha hadn't expected. She posted about the oil on social media. She took a photo of the bottle, wrote a caption about finding a local farmer who was making something extraordinary, tagged the restaurant, tagged Martha's fledgling Facebook page that she had created the week before. Within 24 hours, Martha had messages from 3 more restaurants, 2 specialty food stores, and a distributor who worked with organic products across the Midwest. She went home and pressed oil for 16 hours straight. Then she slept for 4 hours. Then she pressed for another 16. She hired a local teenager, a girl named Becky whose family was struggling almost as much as hers, to help with bottling and labeling. She bought a second press with the deposit from Rosa, a bigger one, used, from a farmer in Kansas who was getting out of the oil business. She converted the entire barn into a processing facility, installing stainless steel tables, a filtration system, a bottling line made from parts she ordered online, and assembled herself with YouTube tutorials and phone calls to Carl at midnight. The co-op heard about it. Dale Henderson called her in December, his voice cautious, curious, something else she couldn't identify. "Martha, I heard you're pressing your corn into oil. Is that true?" "It is," she said. "And people are buying it?" "They are." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I looked at Patrick's old files. The feasibility study. I knew about it. He showed it to me back in 2015. I told him it was interesting but not practical. Too small scale. Too niche. Too risky. I told him to focus on what he knew. Growing corn, selling to the co-op, being a good farmer in the system we had. And now, I don't know what to tell you. The board's asking questions. Other farmers are asking questions. They want to know if this is something they should be doing too. If the co-op should be getting into value-added products. If we've been wrong about everything." Martha thought about that. About the power of one person doing something differently. About the way a single tree could change the landscape. A single voice could change a conversation. A single bottle of oil could change an entire system. "I don't know if you're wrong about everything, Dale," she said. "I just know you were wrong about my corn." By January, she had sold 5,000 gallons of oil. By February, 10,000. By March, she had hired 3 more people, converted the old machine shed into additional processing space, and was negotiating with a distributor who wanted to put her oil in Whole Foods stores across the Midwest. The price had gone up. She was charging $18 a gallon wholesale now, $22 retail, and she still couldn't keep up with demand. The bank called, not to threaten foreclosure, but to offer her a line of credit. The co-op called, not to terminate her membership, but to ask if she would teach a workshop on value-added products. The county extension office called, wanting to feature her in their newsletter. The state agriculture department called, inviting her to speak at a conference on the future of small-scale farming. She said yes to some of it, no to most of it. She was too busy. The presses ran 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. The corn that had been worthless as grain was liquid gold as oil, and every drop that flowed from the spigot was a rebuke to the system that had told her to quit, a vindication of Patrick's vision, a testament to the stubbornness that he had identified as the core of her farming identity. But it wasn't easy. Nothing about it was easy. The equipment broke down, the filters clogged, the bottles arrived cracked, the labels peeled off in humid weather. A batch went rancid because she hadn't understood the importance of storage temperature, and she had to recall 200 gallons and refund customers and apologize in a way that made her feel like a failure all over again. The health inspector found a violation in her processing setup and shut her down for 3 days while she fixed it. 3 days of lost production that she couldn't afford. A competitor emerged, a bigger operation in Illinois with better equipment and more capital, undercutting her price and threatening her market share. She worked through it all. She fixed the equipment, changed the filters, found a new bottle supplier, redesigned the labels, learned about oxidation and storage and shelf life, passed the inspection, adjusted her prices, found new markets that the competitor wasn't serving. She worked 18-hour days, slept on a cot in the barn, ate meals standing up, lost 20 pounds, developed a permanent crick in her neck from leaning over the press, and she was happy. Not happy in the way she had been happy with Patrick, not the deep contentment of a life shared with someone who understood her completely, but happy in a different way, a harder way, a way that came from building something with her own hands, from proving something to herself, from standing in the barn at 3 in the morning watching golden oil flow from a machine she had learned to operate, and knowing that she had done this. She had taken the corn that the world had rejected and turned it into something the world wanted. She had taken the farm that the co-op had written off and made it profitable. She had taken the life that had seemed over and made it new. In April, she paid off the credit union loan. In May, she paid off the credit card. In June, she made the first payment on the farm mortgage that she had been behind on for 2 years. In July, she hired a farm manager to help with the growing side of the operation, freeing her to focus on the processing and the business. In August, she broke ground on a new processing facility, a real one, with concrete floors and proper ventilation, and enough space for 6 presses running simultaneously. She visited Patrick's grave in September, on the anniversary of his death. She brought him a bottle of the oil, set it on the headstone, sat in the grass beside him, and talked. She told him about the restaurant in Iowa City that had put her oil on every table. She told him about the Whole Foods deal. She told him about the farmer from Nebraska who had called to thank her, because her success had inspired him to start pressing sunflower oil, and he was making it work too. She told him about the workshop she had taught at the co-op, standing in front of 40 farmers who had once laughed at the idea of value-added products, watching their faces change as they understood that there was another way, a way that didn't depend on commodity prices, or co-op boards, or a system that had never really worked for people like them. "I did it. Patrick," she said, "I didn't do it the way you would have. I made mistakes you wouldn't have made. I took risks you might not have taken. But I did it. I saved the farm. I saved us." The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the maple trees that shaded the graves. She sat there for a long time, until the sun began to set and the shadows grew long, and then she stood up, brushed the grass from her jeans, and walked back to her truck. She didn't look back at the grave. She didn't need to. Patrick was with her in the barn, in the press, in every bottle of oil that carried the Brennan name. He was with her in the stubbornness that had carried her through, in the refusal to quit that he had identified as her birthright. She drove home to the farm that was no longer failing, to the barn that was no longer empty, to the house that was no longer silent. The presses were running when she arrived, the sound of them a steady rhythm that had become the heartbeat of her new life. Becky was there, working the bottling line, her face streaked with oil, and her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who had found purpose in work that mattered. The other employees were there too. 3 women and 2 men from the county who had been unemployed or underemployed or simply lost, who had found in Martha's crazy idea something they hadn't expected: dignity, community. A reason to get up in the morning. She walked through the barn, touching the presses, checking the temperature gauges, smelling the sweet nutty scent of fresh oil, and she thought about the co-op letter that Dale Henderson had handed her 14 months before. The letter that had told her to quit. The letter that had said her corn was worthless. The letter that had been, in its own terrible way, the best thing that had ever happened to her. Because, without that letter, she would never have opened Patrick's laptop. She would never have found the feasibility study. She would never have driven to Nebraska, never met Carl, never learned to press oil, never discovered that she was more than a farmer, more than a widow, more than the sum of the losses that had defined her life. She would have harvested the corn, sold it at a loss, paid what she could, fallen further behind, and eventually done what the system expected her to do: sell the farm, move to town, disappear into the statistics of agricultural decline. Instead, she had become something else: a maker, a business owner, a teacher, a symbol, though she hated that word, of what was possible when you refused to accept the verdict of a system that didn't understand your value. Farmers came from across the Midwest to visit her operation, to learn from her, to ask questions she didn't always have answers to. Journalists came to write about her, to tell her story in magazines and newspapers, and eventually a documentary that aired on PBS. Politicians came to shake her hand and have their photos taken in front of her presses, to claim her success as evidence of policies they had supported or wanted to support. She tolerated all of it because it served the larger purpose. Because every farmer who learned to press oil, every consumer who bought local, every person who understood that the food system was broken and could be fixed, all of it was a step toward the world that Patrick had imagined. A world where farmers were not victims of commodity markets, but creators of value. Where the land was not just a factory for grain production, but a source of unique, place-based products that carried stories and meaning. By the end of the second year, she had paid off the farm mortgage entirely. The 80 acres that the co-op had written off as a loss had generated, through oil processing, more than $600,000 in revenue. She had expanded to 120 acres, planting not just commodity corn but heritage varieties that produced oil with distinct flavors. A blue corn that made oil with a deep earthy richness, a flint corn that produced oil with a bright, almost citrus note, a dent corn that was the workhorse of her operation. Reliable and consistent and beloved by her restaurant customers, she built a new house on the property. Not because the old farmhouse wasn't sufficient, but because she wanted to honor the farm's history while building its future. She kept the old house as a museum of sorts, a place where visitors could see how 5 generations of Brennans had lived, could touch the furniture that Patrick's grandfather had built, could stand in the kitchen where she had sat with the bills and the letter and the despair that had almost ended everything. The co-op changed too. Not immediately, not completely, but enough. Dale Henderson retired, and the new manager was a woman named Sarah who had worked in value-added agriculture in Wisconsin and understood that the future of farming was not in bigger combines and higher yields, but in smaller operations with direct market connections and products that told a story. The co-op started offering processing services, helping farmers turn their grain into flour, oil, and other products. They created a brand, Prairie Valley Artisan, that featured products from local farms, sold at farmers markets and specialty stores across the region. Martha became a board member. She sat in meetings where decisions were made about the future of agriculture in her county, her state, her region. She spoke at conferences and testified before legislative committees and wrote op-eds for agricultural publications. She never forgot where she had come from. The gravel parking lot, the letter in her pocket, the combine in the barn, the grave in the cemetery. She never forgot the fear or the doubt, or the nights when she had wondered if she was crazy, if she should quit, if the laughter she imagined was real or just the echo of her own insecurity. And she never forgot the oil. The first golden drop that had flowed from the press, the moment when she had held the bottle to the light and understood that she had made something, that she was a maker, that the farm was not just a place where things grew, but a place where things were created, transformed, given meaning and value beyond what the commodity market could measure. She thought about that sometimes, late at night, walking through the processing facility that had replaced the barn, past the 6 presses that ran 24 hours a day, past the employees who had become her friends and partners and family, past the bottles that moved along the conveyor belt, toward the shipping area where trucks waited to carry her oil to restaurants and stores and homes across the country. She thought about the system that had tried to write her off, the co-op board that had seen her corn as a liability, the market that had valued her work at less than nothing, and she thought about what she had built instead. Not just a business, not just a brand, a proof of concept. A demonstration that the old way was not the only way, that the system that had failed her was not the only system, that a single person, armed with nothing but stubbornness and a crazy idea and the refusal to quit, could change not just their own fate, but the fate of everyone who saw what they had done and realized that they could do it too. The co-op man who had handed her the letter had been wrong. Not because he was cruel or stupid or malicious. He had been wrong because he was trapped in a way of thinking that measured value only in bushels and dollars and quarterly returns. He had been wrong because he couldn't see what Martha could see, that the corn in her field was not a commodity to be sold at the lowest possible price, but a raw material for something unique, something that carried her name and her story, and the 120 years of Brennan family farming. He had been wrong because he didn't understand that the most valuable thing a farmer produces is not grain or meat or milk, but the knowledge of how to transform the land's bounty into something that nourishes people in body and spirit, that the farm is not a factory but a workshop, that the farmer is not a grower but a maker, an artist, a creator of value that cannot be replicated by machines or corporations or systems that treat the land as a resource to be extracted rather than a partner to be respected. Martha understood this now. She had learned it the hard way, through failure and doubt, and the long nights when she had wondered if she was building something real or just delaying the inevitable. She had learned it through the oil that flowed from her presses, through the customers who wrote to tell her that her corn oil had changed the way they cooked, through the farmers who visited her farm and left with a new vision of what their own operations could become. She had learned it through the simple act of refusing to quit, of taking the verdict of a system that didn't understand her and using it as fuel for something better, of turning the co-op's rejection into her own revolution, one bottle of oil at a time. And the farm? The farm thrived. Not just financially, though the numbers were good, better than they had ever been. The farm thrived because it had found its purpose again, because it was no longer just a place where corn grew and was sold, and the cycle repeated with diminishing returns. It was a place where something was made, where creativity and skill and hard work combined to produce something that couldn't be found anywhere else, something that carried the essence of the land and the people who tended it, The old barn was still there, preserved as a reminder of where the journey had begun. The combine sat in the center bay, restored and maintained, used now for demonstration purposes, a symbol of the old way that had given way to the new. The fields stretched to the horizon, green in spring, gold in fall, a landscape that had been farmed for 5 generations and would be farmed for 5 more, not because of inheritance or tradition, but because it was worth farming. Because the work mattered, because the products that came from this land were unique and valuable and necessary. Martha was 60 when she finally slowed down, not retired. She would never retire, would never stop working, would never leave the farm that had become her life's work and her legacy. But she stepped back from the day-to-day operations, handing the reins to Becky, who had grown from a teenage bottler into a skilled manager with a degree in food science and a vision for the future that matched Martha's own. She spent her mornings in the garden she had planted behind the old house, growing vegetables and flowers, tending the soil with the same care she had once given the corn. She spent her afternoons on the porch, in the swing that Patrick had hung 30 years before, watching the sun move across the fields, listening to the sound of the presses in the distance, feeling the breeze that carried the scent of oil and earth and something else, possibility, maybe, or hope, or the simple satisfaction of a life well lived. Visitors still came, farmers seeking advice, students writing papers, journalists looking for a story. She received them all with the same patience and honesty, telling them the truth about her journey, the failures as well as the successes, the doubts as well as the certainties, the nights when she had almost quit, and the mornings when she had decided to keep going. She told them about the co-op letter, about Dale Henderson and the board that had written off her corn, about the moment when she had realized that the system that had failed her was not the only system, that there were other ways to farm, other ways to live, other ways to measure success than the ones she had been taught. And she told them about the oil, the first golden drop, the moment of creation, the feeling of holding something in her hands that she had made, that carried her name, that represented not just a product but a philosophy, a way of being in the world that valued patience and creativity and the refusal to accept defeat. That's what farming is, she would say, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of everything she had learned. Not growing things, not selling things, making things, creating value, telling a story, building something that lasts. The co-op wrote me off because they couldn't see that. They saw corn. I saw possibility. They saw a loss. I saw a beginning. That's the difference. That's what makes a farmer. Not the land, not the equipment, the vision, the stubbornness, the refusal to quit. She would gesture toward the processing facility, toward the trucks loading bottles for shipment, toward the fields that stretched green and gold to the horizon. That corn they told me to leave in the field, it's in restaurants in New York and Chicago and San Francisco. It's in home kitchens across the country. It's in the hands of people who understand that food is not just fuel but story, not just commodity but connection. And every bottle that leaves this farm is a message to every farmer who has ever been told to quit, a message to every person who has ever been written off, a message that says, they were wrong. You are not a loss. You are a beginning. You are not worthless. You are waiting to be transformed. She would pause then, looking out at the land that had been her teacher and her trial and her triumph, and she would smile. Not the smile of someone who had won, but the smile of someone who had survived, who had learned, who had grown into something she had never expected to become. The co-op wrote off my corn, she would say, but they couldn't write off me. They couldn't write off the idea that a farmer could be more than a grower. They couldn't write off the possibility that the old way was not the only way. And they certainly couldn't write off the oil, The oil that paid off the farm. The oil that saved my life. The oil that proved once and for all that the most valuable thing we produce is not what we grow but what we make of it. The sun would set then, painting the sky in colors that reminded her of the oil itself, gold and amber, and the deep, rich brown of earth that has known both drought and flood and has survived them all. She would sit in the swing and watch the darkness come, and she would think about Patrick, about the feasibility study he had written and never lived to implement, about the vision he had had for a farm that was not just a producer of commodities, but a creator of value. She would think about the letter in her jacket pocket, the one she had kept all these years, folded and worn soft from handling. She didn't need to read it anymore. She knew every word, but she kept it as a reminder of where she had been, a reminder of what she had overcome, a reminder that the systems that try to write us off are not the final arbiters of our worth. And she would think about the farmers who came to her, who left with new ideas and new hope and new determination to build something that mattered. She would think about the restaurants that served her oil, the customers who wrote to thank her, the community that had grown around her farm, like the roots of a tree spreading deep and wide beneath the surface of the earth. She would think about all of it, and she would know, with a certainty that came from experience rather than faith, that the story was not over, that the oil would continue to flow, that the farm would continue to thrive, that the message she had sent to the world, the message that a written-off farm could be saved, that a written-off crop could be transformed, that a written-off life could be redeemed, would continue to spread, to inspire, to change the way people thought about farming and food and the possibility of building something beautiful from the wreckage of a system that had never deserved their trust. The co-op had written off her 80 acres of corn as a loss, but the oil press had paid off the whole farm, not just financially, not just practically, but in every way that mattered, in vision, in purpose, in the stubborn, unkillable belief that the work of our hands, when guided by hope and sustained by refusal to quit, can transform not just our own lives, but the world we inhabit. That was the story of Martha Brennan. That was the story of Brennan Farm cold-pressed corn oil. That was the story of every person who had ever been told they were finished and had found, in the depths of their own determination, the strength to begin again. And it was a story that would be told for generations, in kitchens and restaurants and farm fields across the country, wherever someone held a bottle of golden oil to the light and saw, in its clarity and color, the proof that the written off can be redeemed, the lost can be found, and the farm that was supposed to die can live forever in the work of hands that refuse to let it go.